And so the job of the community organizer fundamentally is to foster this thing we call democracy. It was disturbing in many ways, but I was also troubled by the apparent lack of appreciation of how the conservative movement itself has benefited so much from community organizing. There would be no conservative movement today as we know it if Ralph Reed and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and all those leaders from the evangelical community had not adopted some of the best practices from the civil rights movement. They go to the Supreme Court, they hold protests, they're doing a lot of leadership development. They run leaders for school boards who eventually go up the food chain to run for Congress and beyond. Sort of classic community organizing. They do sit-ins, they do civil disobedience, and the stuff that really made the civil rights movement. So it was a display of hypocrisy that I just found disturbing. So what I want to do is really, in many ways, we need to resurrect organizing. We need to resurrect this idea of making people take control and take charge of their lives by being active. When I was thinking about this presentation today, I was struggling with it because there's just so many of these moments in American history when citizens have organized and they've galvanized and just made such transformative change. And so we don't have time to go through that. I can just mention a little bit about going all the way back to the anti-slavery movement, that although everybody knows the anti-slavery movement was not as successful because it really required the Civil War to end slavery. But what they did was really to create the environment, to prepare the environment, to prepare the country for a multiracial society, for tolerance. And the movement itself groomed a lot of leaders who became very important leaders. Susan B. Anthony was active in the anti-slavery movement. She became a leader in the women's rights movement, a women's suffragette, and presided over passage of the right to vote for women back in 1920. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, strong women who eventually really became figures in promoting rights, not just for African Americans, but for women in general. They really learned a lot from the anti-slavery movement. Labor, I don't need to spend too much time on that, except to say that the labor movement is in my view, and I don't know what went wrong. I don't understand a lot of the maligning that has gone on of the labor movement. Part of that, I think, comes from the failure of labor leaders to really robustly defend the idea of labor organizing, the importance of labor unions in the advancement of democracy. It's hard to imagine Western societies. It's hard to imagine Western Europe. It's hard to imagine the United States. It's hard to imagine Canada outside of this general context in which labor unions were formed and were party to a very transformative change. We take for granted the 8-hour day. That came because men and women fought hard and paid sometimes with their lives to make that happen. It didn't happen because employers or members of Congress got up some morning with a newfound sensitivity to workers. They were actually pushed to do that. Overtime pay, the weekend, vacations. Next time you take a vacation, you should take a moment to thank labor union activists who made that happen. So much of this does not need to be belabored, but I think that we do need occasionally to remind people why this is such an important fabric of any democratic society. I can take you to countries today that don't have labor unions, whether it's in Africa, in Asia, and they're looking societies that are fairly marginal in many senses of the word. Labor unions have been the critical component, the critical variable in creating both social stability, strong middle classes. And this is not to malign employers. Most employers are just, they're great people, decent people who want to do the right thing. But we understand that employers are under pressure, and especially today, they are under enormous pressure for that company to perform on Wall Street, please those stockholders, and CEOs are under the gun. You get fired the moment you slip, the moment your ratings slip on Wall Street. And so in that environment, typically workers and the environment and communities becomes sort of this low-hanging fruit. If you want to cut costs, you go to the workers. If abiding by EPA rules is too expensive, you find ways to bypass that and dump toxins in unsafe places. So what this does is necessitate citizen action. It necessitates citizens as really stakeholders in society to make sure that when CEOs are making decisions, that those decisions are not biased in favor, too much in favor of profits at the expense of people, at the expense of communities, and at the expense of workers. And certainly having labor unions, having workers have a voice enables that to happen. And of course, labor, we oftentimes make the mistake of thinking of labor strictly in terms of collective bargaining. That's really important. But labor unions, the reasons we should have labor unions, and it's a right, quite frankly, the right to join a union is a right that should stand by itself. A lot of us get very defensive. We like to explain how wonderful it is. It builds the middle class, and it creates social stability, and all those things are wonderful. They're great. But it's a right that ought to stand. It's in a democracy, in a constitutional democracy, it's a right that really stands on its own. Kind of like free speech, right? I don't have to justify why I need free speech. I don't have to say, oh, give me free speech. I'm going to be saying wonderful things that you're going to like to hear. Yeah, that's fine. But fundamentally, I don't need to be defensive about that right. It is a legal right to form a union, and we should not forget that. The civil rights movement is, for me growing up, we were riveted to the TV. My parents, by African standards, I guess you could say, were middle class. And so we had a little TV. We were riveted to the tube, watching the civil rights struggle on television and listening to Dr. King's speeches. And so it just became this, the United States became this place that I thought, wow, this is really, really great. Because those of you who are students of history know that Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, South Africa and Namibia, all those countries during that time, back in the 70s, were under very repressive white minority regimes. So we were really admiring this effort that was underway in the United States to force political change. There was a lot of resistance, but eventually people came around, and because of the efforts of the civil rights leaders, as you know, we got the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act back in 1965. And the United States is a better place because citizens took to the streets. It was a multiracial movement that really is exemplary in how it did it by being nonviolent and focusing on the prize, as the leaders used to like to say. The environmental movement is one of my favorites. I just think that, and by the way, we have a sort of caricature sometimes that the environmental movement is a kind of the exclusive province of lefty folks like us, progressives. I want to read to you a John Zogby poll that was taken last year during the election. Likely Republican voters in 5 early primary or caucus states, California, Iowa, New Hampshire, New York, South Carolina. Of those surveyed, 93% of Republicans said protecting the environment was important in deciding their vote for a candidate. That is the same percentage of Republican primary voters who called, quote unquote, encouraging family values important in deciding their vote. More than cutting taxes by 91%, and substantially more than restricting abortion, which came at 61%. So there's a broad consensus in the United States that the sanctity of the environment ought to be preserved. This ought not to be a partisan issue. And 55% of Republicans, in fact, do say in polls that their party is on the wrong side of the environmental divide. It's a movement that you could say against all odds created what are some of the most far-reaching environmental laws in the world. The Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. You can go on and on and on.